Welcome back to my Blender Weekly Progress Report, a series where I showcase everything I've learned in practice in the past week in the 3D rendering software Blender, in order to document my journey and to share any pieces of knowledge I gather along the way. Since I knew work was coming up for me this week and that it would be time consuming, my goal was to complete as many Blender projects as possible. Monday began by following the tutorial by CG Cookie on their website called Press Start. This has you following along as you make a Gameboy, pretty much. This project was the first time that I ran into a few problems that I will cover up later on. The project began by adding in references for the project in mind and making sure that whatever angle we used, the shapes and dimensions would be lined up accordingly. While it was possible to do the Gameboy to the exact specifications, I had something else in mind, which was to design a Gameboy with the Sleepless Fire theme. One of the coolest things that started the project off was creating one of the faces of the Gameboy, but also implementing like the directional pad and the buttons and creating a series of separate faces and then connecting them in edit mode, which is something I personally haven't done before. With the most important part being to make sure we create clean connections between each area. It was also cool using the bevel tool modifier as opposed to just beveling to showcase how the bevels would interact with the object without necessarily altering the object and then having to undo those alterations, which would be extremely difficult. And then just making sure all the normals of the object were facing in the right direction, and first day was done. All in all, the project was pretty straightforward and my understanding of modeling deepened when it came to connecting faces with objects in edit mode. I really felt that my personal growth in Blender was showing. I finished Monday with 4 hours and 5 minutes of blending done so far. Tuesday, I continued the project with adding more details to the Gameboy. This included the directional pad, the start, stop, A and B button. While the start and select were just text given depth, the A and B button were given a Boolean modifier to make them indentations into the buttons. It wasn't until a little bit later that I ran into another problem that significantly altered the geometry of the Gameboy. But again, I'll get into this later. After selecting and adding a bunch of shaders to the Gameboy, which included having to select each and every speaker, we finally got some color going on this. The next step was adding some of the Sleepless Fire stuff you might have seen before, like the logo or my flag animation. Well, I added those with the logo being on the cartridge and the animation being playing on the video on the screen. CG Cookie gave a pretty thorough tutorial and it gave me nostalgia of my own childhood seeing something like that come to life. Gave it a backdrop and some lighting, and here's the final result. Since Tuesday I woke up at like 6 to get this done, I had plenty of time and energy to keep going. I had the intention of also doing a Gameboy designed for my friends over at Crimson Tower Pictures. I just took their logo, got rid of the background, and did the same thing for the first Gameboy to their second. And now we have a Sleepless Fire Studio and a Crimson Tower Pictures Gameboy. I finished the night watching a bunch of fun stuff with the guys in Discord, and all in all, this gave about 9 hours of blendering. So for this project, I kept mentioning I ran into some problems while trying to model and create the Gameboy. These were problems that obviously didn't happen during the tutorial videos, so I had to do a lot of troubleshooting and problem solving myself. I also turned to the CG Cookie community for some insight as well. On Monday, the first problem, which was a quick fix, was making sure the normals were in the right direction. Okay, no problem. The real issue though was the fact that there was some odd shading going on in my project. I thought it might have been the normals acting up, but as it turns out, I pressed Shade Auto Smooth, which turns out was creating the issue. I went back and forth so many times, and for some reason, the Auto Flat tool was not working. I turned off Blender, cooled off for like 30 minutes playing Warhammer 3, and
summon the Elector Counts!
When I came back, it worked. I guess Blender needed to cool off too. Tuesday had the most issues, I would say. The first being the fact that the bevel tool was acting up and not displaying properly. The fix of that was turning off clamping. The second was that for some reason certain vertices and faces were joined in at the center of the object. It would also only display in object mode, so I wasn't sure how to fix it. I turned to the community for help, but ended up trying out just deleting the center vertices and reconnecting the faces, which thankfully only turned out to be just one. The final one was centered around the normals of the speakers and some small areas. It just took a ton of selecting and deselecting to make sure that everything was in place properly. Despite these hiccups, I'm glad to again see my progress showing. I went to bed with the goal of trying to recreate my logo in 3D for the first time. Using much of what I practiced these past couple of days, I was able to create new faces and connect them in a way that would support quads or n-gons or triangles, still figuring that part out. I ran into the same problem where I believe some duplicate vertices created awkward faces, and when I tried deleting them, it recreated the whole mesh. At least because of the practice yesterday, I was able to make sure all the normals were correct and all the pieces were connected. I looked up a quick tutorial on making a gradient in Blender, slapped it on, threw in some textures, some lighting, and came up with this. I finished Wednesday at 3 hours and 35 minutes. So I actually didn't end up recording any footage. I kind of wanted to create something without the pressure of being recorded and feeling time during the whole process. I wanted to try something simple this time, so I went with a mug. This took about 2 hours to make all together, but it was again fun problem solving new modeling methods, and one day I kind of plan on showing how I was able to create the handle. So all in all, I think I spent about 20 hours in Blender this week. I added some time there because there were moments I forgot to hit record during my sessions. I found myself getting super involved in the projects, and it just kept happening. But because I had to work at a very intensive event that following weekend, I wasn't really able to blend going into the weekend, which is why I kind of went hard on the first few days. It's also why I wasn't able to post on Mondays like I normally do. I was just extremely exhausted. This week was good in seeing how can I maintain momentum for my goals, which I'll talk about next week hopefully, for myself and for this channel and for the idea of Sleepless Fire Studios. At the end of the day, I'm always happy with my progress, and hopefully you learn something from my mistakes and victories as well. Until then, see you next week.